Hi, I'm just gonna wait a few minutes to see if other people want to join, and then I'll get started. If you have any questions that you sort of want addressed, feel free to put them in the chat and I will try to answer them as we go. And if we have time at the end of the presentation, I will try to answer as many of those chat problems or chat questions as possible. And so again, I'm just gonna wait just a couple minutes or a minute or two longer, and I'll just keep letting people in as they come. So I'll just let people trickle in. Thank you for joining me on a Friday afternoon. I appreciate it. And I really hope that everybody finds this helpful in some way. All right, I think I'm just gonna get started. I'm gonna let people in as they come because they're still coming in, but I don't want to run out of time. And I know that everybody's busy and it's a Friday afternoon. So I'm Dr. Tori Hidalgo. I am an associate professor at the University of Arizona. I've been teaching here for about 15 years. I always say my heart lies in the Gen Chem classroom, but I have taught upper division graduate level chemistry courses. I've taught professional development courses as well. And I started off as a physical therapy major and just sort of fell in love with chemistry, which is why I ended up switching majors to chemistry. But I am also incredibly dyslexic, and I really struggled through school. And because of my struggles, I became really interested in learning, and I've become more interested in learning as I've progressed through my career of education. And so that's really sort of where this passion of mine has come from, why I love teaching the Gen Chem class, is it gives me the opportunity to sort of teach some of these skills. So what I want to do here is share some of what I've learned and give you some tools that you can start with right away and hopefully build off of as you go. So just to sort of get started here, the first thing that was really surprising to me personally was, and how much there's a misunderstanding of this, is that studying is not learning. And oftentimes there's this confusion that thinking, well, I'm spending all this time studying, and there's sort of this assumption that you're learning because you're doing something. And the bottom line is studying is the physical process and the types of things that we do with the hope that we're able to achieve cognitive outcome of learning. Whereas learning is a mental process. And it's something that happens in our brain, which allows us to retain information and use or apply that information when solving problems. And a lot of times we are basically told what we are supposed to learn, and we're not given any tools or strategies or information on how to learn what we're told to learn. And what I have found so surprising is the main tools that we are kind of taught, and most of what we use of reading and highlighting and rereading and writing our notes are what are called really low order thinking skills, and are essentially not very helpful towards the process of learning. And this is where we start to feel really stuck, or we are working hours upon hours upon hours and finding that we're not really achieving the goals that we want, meaning the grades that we want on assessments. So when I first started teaching, we really spent hours upon hours in these faculty learning communities thinking about what's called Bloom or solo taxonomy. And what this is really sort of a structure of outcome of learning. So when we are in high school, and specifically sort of in our junior year of high school, we are really thinking about remembering things. So lots of flashcards, lots of reading, and thinking about things in what is called a unistructural event. Just thinking about concepts in a very isolated way. And can we kind of memorize and regurgitate what we've learned? But that again is sort of the beginning aspects of all of this. And as we move up in high school, we're expected to go more into these higher order learning processes of understanding and starting to think about applying the concepts and making relationships. And so this is where now we're not thinking about things quite so isolated, but we're starting to recognize that there are connections between the material that we're learning. And when it comes to applying, now we have to start making relationships between things and understanding why something happens as a result of something else. And now starting to make these relationships between topics, which is a harder thing to do. And when we get to the university region, and when we get to the college level of things, well, now what we talked about in our faculty meetings is writing questions that are at the top of this Bloom's taxonomy, which are really requiring these sorts of relational and like this categorizing and this idea of grouping things together and forming categories and seeing how one thing goes with another and analyzing them and examining them and evaluating how they relate to each other. And that's the way we write questions for our college exams. And that's the type of thinking that we expect our college students to have. And when you get to the very top of this pyramid and this idea of creating, that's sort of a medical school, a graduate level type of thinking, and the highest, what we call order of learning skills that are really required for that type of graduate level thinking. And what I really discovered was that, okay, all we do is talk about how we can create these high order and these really like relationship type of analyses and evaluating type of questions for our students. And we're never talking about how we can teach our students to learn to prepare themselves for these types of questions. And I have become incredibly invested in trying to teach learning practices to my students so that they are capable of answering these types of questions and meeting the expectations that we have at this college level, and then of course beyond. So if we're thinking about revising this a little bit, again, this is that Bloom's taxonomy, so sort of that pyramid of thinking. Again, the bottom of this is really what we call lower order thinking skills. Thinking about things in a very isolated way. Can we just sort of recall and memorize some things? And can we start to explain things and construct some sort of meaning and understanding towards the types of information that we're learning? As we move up, again, in this area, this is what we call higher order thinking skills. So the ability to make relationships and categorize things and start to understand why one thing works relative to another, and really start linking together all of these ideas in a much more sophisticated way. Are we able to defend and evaluate or support and create some sort of argument for why something occurs? And what I have found is what my students do and what I started doing was using really low order thinking skills, flashcards, highlighting, rereading, rewriting my notes, rereading my notes, and hoping that I could get to higher order thinking in order to be successful in my college level courses. So we tend to start down here and like try to build our way up. But what has been shown neurologically and through just decades of learning science is if you want to be successful with higher order like questions, you need to start studying and preparing. It's kind of like a practice like you play type of idea. You need to start preparing in higher order, using higher order thinking skills. And what happens is all of this sort of lower order thinking starts to be filled in with your brain. So the idea really is that learning is super messy, and it is not linear, and it is progressive. So we need to take control of our own learning, sort of organize the material in a way that makes more sense to us, that doesn't always match the way the book is doing things or the way the lecturer is presenting things, and start to continue to build on sort of a foundational knowledge. So starting with these really high order practices and making connections with our concepts and allowing our brain to recognize the importance and fill in the things that matter as we start like completing this picture. So again, the idea is that a lot of times we're trying to learn these real isolated things, and our brains are awesome at forgetting. And it feels like that's actually a bad thing, but ultimately it's actually really great, because if our brain just kind of had everything stick, then we would remember where we parked like 9 years ago and maybe not be able to remember where we parked this morning, and it would be very difficult to then navigate our way through life. So this is actually a survival skill that our brain has done. And we can take advantage of this and figure out different skills and study techniques that will allow things to stick into our brain. And the way we do that is by finding connections through these topics that we're learning and seeing how they connect to each other. And when you sort of start with this thinking of how can I make these connections of these broad concepts that I'm learning, then what sort of happens is our brain says, oh, now I see why I want to remember this, and things start to stick. So I know that we have all written a bunch of notes and looked back and thought to ourselves, like, I don't even remember writing this. When did I write this? Or going through flashcards and feeling like a hamster running on a wheel. I know that I knew this yesterday, but I cannot remember it again today. So now I'm sort of relearning everything I tried to shove into my brain the day before. But if instead we give our brain context, then it starts to recognize, oh, here is why I care. And as a result of caring, it holds on to that information and starts to organize it in a way that you can recall it. So what I really want to try to teach are the beginning steps of giving our brains context and what I like to call studying with purpose. So I'm really just sort of giving you the stepping stones that can be you can continue to build on until you get to this higher learning sort of thinking range of really high level skills. But if you try to jump from flashcards to just high order thinking, it is going to be overly frustrating, and you're just going to sort of resort back to using lower order thinking skills in order to do what you're doing. So I suggest taking some baby steps and working your way up. But I do want to say that you should feel challenged. So while you are working through your material and doing revisions of your material and preparing for exams, it's really important that you sit with the uncomfortability of struggle and confusion and recognize that that feeling is your brain organizing material and encoding the material in a way that you will be able to understand it and retrieve it in order to be successful on exams. So don't shy away from that struggle. That's how you know that you're doing what you should do. If you're studying and you feel like you're falling asleep and you're super bored, you're studying, you're not doing any learning at that point. So while you're working through your material, make sure that it's challenging to you. That's how you know that there's actual learning going on. And I kind of relate this to doing a crossword puzzle or a Sudoku puzzle. Like, you know, when you're doing that, you're not just like writing down words. You have to think about it and you struggle through it. And then you come up with, oh, I see where this goes together. And so it's that struggle that you need to have as you're working through your study material as well. So I want to, again, start with some sort of beginning steps and hopefully give you some skills that you can integrate into your studying right away and see some results, and then continue to build on as you work through your undergraduate career and move on to a graduate career or med school or whatever it is you might happen to want to do. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is something that's called previewing or scoping, sometimes called pre-studying. And this will lead into note-taking, which leads into what I call consolidation and practice, or what I consider sort of your main studying event. And then there's something which is called targeted review. And I'm going to give you a few skills in each of these areas and define them in a little bit more detail in order for you to hopefully start implementing it into whatever study practices you currently have. But what I also want you to recognize is that this is a cyclical event. So you are, depending on where you are in your material, so if you just finished an exam and you're getting ready for a new exam, then you're going to start with the preview, the scoping, the note-taking, and move through this sort of flow chart. But as you're in the middle of material, then I always recommend, and I'll talk about this a little bit more as I move through this presentation, that you start with the targeted review, move into consolidation and practice, and then go to previewing and scoping whatever comes next. And you're going to continue to grow and revise your notes as you work through the material. So I talk to students a lot and they say, oh, I don't cram. I started studying like a week before the exam. And when you're in college, that is cramming for the exam. So what I am trying to get you to integrate most importantly, if you get anything out of this presentation, I want you to recognize the harder you have to work for it, the more it is going to stick neurologically in your brain. So take the time, sit through the struggle, be confused. That is good for you. And the idea of this targeted review is that you're constantly going to be relating what you are learning now to what you have already learned previously. You're not going to take a lecture, think about that lecture, move on to the next thing, think about it in isolation, move on to the next thing, think about it in isolation, and then the week of the exam, start doing practice problems and think that you're going to be okay. You are instead going to constantly bringing the new stuff into the old stuff. So by the time you get to the week of the exam, you're just kind of filling in a couple of gaps, doing some practice and building your confidence and walking into the exam knowing that you're going to do well because you have just been working through all of the material and building on all of the material through that chunk of time in between exams. So starting with the preview or this idea of scoping, which is looking ahead, I usually recommend to my students that you start 1 week in advance. So say on Sunday, you take a look at the reading that's going to be covered, or if there are lecture notes which are provided for you, just taking a real quick look at that. And as you move higher and get used to these sort of study techniques, I recommend that you do this for all of the material for the next exam. But again, sort of take baby steps up to that and just think about previewing the material 1 week in advance. And the way that I suggest doing this is to just skim or scan the text and provided lecture slides if you have any, and make a list of the key terms, so anything that's bolded, and what are the titles of the headings for the chapters. So if you are, say, going to skim and preview an entire chapter of your textbook, it should not take you longer than 15, maybe 20 minutes to do this. You're not reading this in detail. You are reading this to see what is the big picture. How do these things sort of start coming together? And anything that you really don't understand, you're just going to skip for this first preview time because you're going to come back to the textbook. This won't be the only time you look at the textbook. This is just your first sort of broad overview of what you can expect for the week to come. And you're going to constantly be asking yourself as you go through this material and as you sort of build this list of headings and key terms, how do these concepts relate to each other? Can I find any relationship or make any meaning in terms of how these correspond with each other in some way? And how do these concepts relate to what we previously learned? Is there sort of any integration between these concepts and ways for me to sort of group these ideas together or start categorizing them in some way? How do these relate to what I know, even if it's not from the course at hand? So we all walk into a class with a certain amount of information. And there's what's called an anchoring and an ordering bias, which is saying that the way you process information is based off of what you already know. And so if you are just trying to find sort of these anchor points, or we've all had those like light bulb moments or moments of clarity of like, oh my gosh, everything suddenly makes sense. Usually this is what in learning is called a threshold moment or a threshold concept, where there's just one little connection that needs to be made for everything to start falling into place. So what I'm trying to show are ways for you to reach these threshold moments faster. And it's by actively thinking about making these connections between what you're about to learn, what you're going to learn, what you have learned, and what you already know. And building this real foundational sort of framework of understanding and connections of the material as you move forward. And after you make this list of key terms from your reading and your previewing, or just like your skimming of the material, you're going to take this list of key terms to lecture. And as you're going through your lecture and listening to your professor, you are going to continue to ask yourself the same types of questions. How do these concepts relate to what I just read? How can I connect these concepts to each other? Am I starting to have a greater understanding of how these things all relate to each other based off of what the instructor is telling me? Is anything that this professor is telling me help to prioritize these concepts and recognize like, oh, this is more important, and because of that, this happens? Or the reason why this occurs is because of this. And a lot of times, our brain has a hard time with stuff because you don't even know what this is in order to understand how or why it matters. But once you find out what this is, then you can understand why this matters, but you might not have made that connection if you didn't sort of preview and sort of gain this foundational understanding, or just stick these words into your head so that you kind of know what you're looking for. It's the idea of, if I ask you to read a passage and tell you I'm going to test you on this, you're kind of like, okay, I'm just going to read it and hope that I get there. But if I say, read this and I'm going to test you on what they did on their vacation, then you're going to be looking for that and thinking about, okay, where did they go on vacation? What did they do for their vacation? And that's going to give you some trigger points in order and focus. So by previewing the material and just getting these key terms, even if you don't know what they mean, now you have a little bit of focus. And when the professor says it, you're like, oh, I remember seeing that word. I wrote that down on my list. And you kind of know and are actively taking part in the lecture now and starting to make these connections. And don't write everything down that your professor is saying. You want to mostly be thinking and being engaged in the discussion in class, and just jot down notes after you have sort of answered these questions for yourself. So, oh, okay, now I see why this matters, and this relates to this. Or, you know, I had this question when I walked into the class and it was just answered, and now I can write that answer down. And I often hear students say, what if I miss what my professor is talking about? What if I miss all of the details? And my response to that is, it doesn't really matter, because you're going to go back through this material anyway, and the details don't mean anything to you yet. So you probably won't find an understanding or a place for that to stick, but you'll be able to fill those details in later as you continue to revise the material. But if you have a lot of anxiety around this, see if your instructor records their lectures, because then you can always listen to the recording and you won't miss anything that way. And if your lectures aren't recorded, then you record them for yourself in class. Like, bring in some sort of device, record the lecture, and that way you'll know, okay, I have this, I can actively listen, and you won't have any anxiety about potentially missing any of the details if you do have a lot of anxiety surrounding that. So I typically say that taking notes in class is really just a way to stay awake. There's not a whole lot of use other than jotting down some quick ideas, but most of what should be occurring in class is going on within your head. Where notes become really valuable is actually after class. So when you sit down after class, the first thing that I recommend that you do, and again, it's practice like you play, you are not asked to like look at information and get that information from your notes. You are asked to retrieve that information from your brain. You're actively recall information. So that's how you want to spend most of your time studying. And that's what I recommend you do the first thing when you sit down after class to study the material for that class, is don't open your books, don't look at your notes, and write down on a piece of paper absolutely everything that you can remember from your preview studies and your lecture. And again, constantly asking yourself how everything interconnects with it. But do your best to write down everything that you can remember. And I work with a lot of students who say, well, I don't remember anything. I have no idea what's happening. And then I force them to do this. Take at least 5 minutes to just see what you can remember. And almost always they say, wow, I remember way more than I thought I would, or I actually know more than I anticipated. So take the time and challenge yourself with this. Again, it should be hard. You are recalling stuff from your brain. Work more at pulling stuff out of your brain than trying to shove stuff into your brain. And this is sort of the first way that you can start practicing these types of active recalls in a way that will become really effective towards your learning. So after you've exhausted yourself and you really just cannot remember anything else, that's when you want to open up your books, open up your notes, and from your lecture, open up the slides provided by your instructor and look at what are the things that you forgot or what are the things that you were wrong about. And all of that, it's totally okay to not remember everything, and it's totally okay to misunderstand things. You are just starting with this material and just trying to make sense of it. And your best teacher is your last mistake. So don't be afraid of being wrong while you're working through these types of revision tactics. Then you're going to start filling in these blanks. So the things that you forgot or the things that you got wrong are the concepts that you want to study on during, again, what I call your main study event. So this is giving you a lot of purpose with the time that you're going to spend. You want to spend your time working on the stuff that you don't know instead of just studying what you do know. And we like to study what we know because it's like, yeah, no, this is great. I'm doing awesome. I remember all this stuff. And then you take the exam and you're like, oh, I actually don't understand mostly anything that we have studied. So you want to figure out what that stuff is that you don't understand and you've forgotten while you are studying, not while you're taking the exam. So by doing this, you are just giving yourself targeted review practice. Now I know what I want to study with the time that I have to study for this course. And that brings us to the consolidation and practice portion of your studies, which I call your main study event. So you want to review the material you couldn't remember, take a little bit of time, go back to your textbook, and then, read it for a little bit more detail in these areas. Bring out your lecture slides, see if you can put together the pieces and the things that you forgot or had incorrect in your mind. And what I would really recommend is that you really start to form groups of these key concepts that you had written down. Which things go together, and are you able to categorize these in some way? Like if you were to create a folder in your computer where you were going to store certain concepts for a class, what would you call that folder and what would you put in it? And so that's, again, and a lot of this is a hypothesis, especially when you first starting out, but you need to have some reason why you're creating the groups, not just, well, I don't know, these all start with a C, so I'm going to put them in a group. But well, this seems to sound like this, and I think that it goes with something that I've learned before, and as a result, I'm going to start grouping these together, and I'm going to start calling them and categorizing them in this way. So you have some reasoning. You could be wrong, and you're going to go back and revise these groups, but again, when you're doing this, you want to be actively thinking and engaged in the material and forming a hypothesis that makes sense to you, that you could explain to somebody in terms of why you made the groupings and categorized them the way that you did. And then start to find a flow. Okay, so this group that I'm calling this is necessary in order for this to happen. And the reason why this happens is because of these things. And starting to find and connect all those dots and not thinking about everything as a very isolated sort of fact that your brain is just going to ditch because it doesn't know why it cares. And from there, start doing some homework problems, start doing some practice problems from the book or any of the activities that were given to you from your professor in lecture, and test your understanding. And the other thing that I recommend that you do is explain things to people. So while you're working through your homework problems or your practice problems, how confident are you in your answer, or did you just sort of happen to get there? And if you were to explain your thought process behind why you answered a certain problem the way you did, could you explain that to somebody? And I always recommend, like, your best learning, oftentimes you discover what you don't know through teaching. And so it's also recommended that you don't explain things to students who are taking the same class as you. So I hear this a lot from my students. I'm constantly telling my friends how to do everything, and they killed the exam and I failed the exam, but I was telling them how to do everything while we were studying. But what's happening is there's a knowledge bias, that the people who are in the class with you are filling in the blanks or correcting in their minds the things that you have wrong because they have an understanding of the material, and it's not allowing you to discover what you know and don't know. So when you talk to your mom, explain to her what you're doing in class, or pretend you're talking to somebody. They always say, explain it like it's a 5-year-old. Are you able to really dumb it down in a way that somebody who isn't taking the class can understand it? And if you are unable to explain it, then you don't know it, and you need to spend some more time trying to understand and make these relationships. And as you're working through your homework problems, there's most likely going to be things that you keep getting wrong. So create a list of, these are the concepts that I keep getting wrong. These are the problems that I am mostly struggling with, and source it. This problem number 3 from practice exam 2, or homework question number 16 from chapter 9, homework A, so that you can go back and look at it and again, target yourself with those concepts so that you're really purposeful with your study time. Now, this idea of targeted review is just that. I am going to review the stuff that I'm struggling with. So in my previous study session, these were the concepts and the problems I got wrong. That's where I'm going to start. And again, you're just really ensuring that you're prioritizing the material that you're struggling with, not reviewing the material that you already know. Again, close your books, write out everything you can remember, constantly actively trying to make connections between the material and pull what you know out of your head. And go back to your book, skim through it again, start building on your notes, see where now you can say, oh, now I know why this matters, or this has a lot more relevance. So you're just sort of revising the material and growing on the material as you work through. So you did your pre-study for the week before, you continue to read through it with a little bit more understanding and focus, which allows you to make all the connections that are necessary. And your brain just starts filling in the details. You don't have to actively make a ton of flashcards because your brain is just going to have that material stick because it understands that it cares. And then you're just going to sort of move to this consolidation and practice and start this whole cycle over again. So start with your targeted review, move to consolidation and practice, and then start previewing again. And so again, you're constantly working through all the material and making this real loop of, I'm going to go back to the older stuff and bring it in with the new stuff. And it's going to become this big picture by the time you get to the week of the exam, that now you're just like, oh, here are the few things that I don't understand. I'm going to go to office hours or my tutor with very specific questions. And then you're just kind of tightening it all up so that you're able to just annihilate that exam. And there's nothing that they can throw at you that you haven't already kind of considered in one way or another. The other thing is, as I said, learning is nonlinear, and again, it's progressive. So that's why we're constantly bringing back the old stuff in with the new stuff and doing what's called the snowball effect of, you're just going to keep growing on your knowledge as you go through. And as you start understanding more, your brain will retain more and make more connections and bring it all together so that you're able to tackle these really intricate, like high level thinking types questions that your college professors are going to expect of you. And so what I mean by linear versus nonlinear note taking is, most of us like to write notes like this. Here is the subject heading, here is this detailed explanation of everything, and I'm just going to write it all in this sort of bulleted outlined fashion. But I am going to strongly encourage that you slowly step away from this type of note taking and into what's called a mind map, or a nonlinear way of creating notes. So here's where you're starting to make connections and seeing where certain things matter with other things, and building on this mind map in a way that shows, it's called a mind map because it's a map of how you think through the material and how you're going to be able to pull certain information out when you need to and relate it to another concept when you need to integrate those concepts on an exam when you're applying those concepts to some question that you've never seen before. So these are really important. Like, the whole reason you're taking notes is to gain an understanding and form relationships and prioritize and group. And all of this is really difficult and also really great for the process of learning. So the best way to start with this, because it's not easy, you can't really go from something like this straight into something like this, and these can be very intricate. So this is why I recommend that you make a list of these key terms. You start thinking about how you can group these terms together in some purposeful way. You create categories of the groups that you have made, and you start to find a flow and connection between these categories. And as you learn more, you're most likely going to go back and say, okay, actually, this group doesn't make sense at all. I'm going to start all over again. And then you revise based off of what you know. And eventually you get to a place where all your grouping and your categorizing is correct. And you're just kind of building off of it as you're filling in the details. And you want to keep your notes really minimal. So we like to trick ourselves by using recognition patterns instead of retrieval practices. And what I mean by this is, if you have ever done an exam and done a practice problem and you get it wrong, and then you look at the answer and you're like, oh, I know how to do that. That is only because you recognize it, but you don't know how to do it, because if you did, you would have been able to do it by yourself the first time. And that is called recognition. And it's the same idea with your notes. The more you have written down, the more you trick yourself into thinking that you know stuff because you recognize it. But if you're asked to retrieve that information, you are unable to do it, and you only discover that on exams. So you want to keep your notes minimal so that you fill in the blanks with the things that you know. And then when you get to something that you're unsure of, you don't have it defined right there for you. You're trying to define it from what you remember. And if you can't remember it, then you're going to have to go look it up and take a little bit of time to reevaluate and revise that material. So the classic example I like to use of this is, we all recognize our phones, and I know that I'm looking at my home screen and I can find whatever app that I want to find. But if I asked you to draw your phone in total detail, what are the apps in the particular order and how are they organized within each folder? What portion of the picture that you have on your home screen is covered up by the apps? You are going to have a really hard time doing that, even though you look at your phone all the time. And that's the difference between recognizing it and retrieving every itty bitty detail of it. Or a dollar bill. If I was like, draw a dollar bill from memory in as much detail as you possibly can, you are going to have a hard time retrieving that information, even though you recognize a dollar bill really quickly. And so this is the same idea with studying. Don't fool yourself by thinking that you know stuff because you recognize it. Force yourself to retrieve it, because that's what you're going to be asked to do on the exam. And force yourself to make the connections while you're doing the studying and really struggling through that, so you don't figure out these gaps in your knowledge while you're taking an exam or when you get that exam back. And I like to consider that it's a lot like building a jigsaw puzzle. We all have built a jigsaw puzzle at some point in our lives. And the first thing that most of us do is look for the flat edge pieces and put them to the side, and then start organizing the pieces by color. Like, you look at the picture and, okay, I think all of these will go together, and I think all of these will go together. And then we build the outside. And that's a little bit challenging, but, you know, because we've sort of organized our pieces in a way that allows us to fit together, they become a little bit easier. And then we start building in that second border. And that border within the outside is the hardest part. And that's where we have to start reorganizing things. Like, oh, well, I thought these blue ones would all be the sky, but it turns out some of them are actually the ocean. So I have to reorganize my groups because I was wrong the first time I put it together. Same idea with the concepts you're learning with class. And putting in that second layer of the jigsaw puzzle is really tough. Like, that's the hardest part, where you're really challenging yourself. But once you build that second part in, then it becomes easier and easier to fill in the middle. And that's sort of putting the details in. Your brain is going to start doing that. It becomes easier and easier as you've built this foundation up. So what we tend to do is, if I'm going to build a jigsaw puzzle from lower order learning thinking, that would be me taking a piece and saying, I'm going to memorize every itty bitty detail of this piece. And now I'm going to learn a different piece, and I'm going to take every little itty bitty detail of this piece and put it to memory and put it aside, and hope that after memorizing every little piece, I can create a puzzle from that. But by the time I get to the 5th puzzle piece, I'm going to forget what the first puzzle piece looked like. And I'm going to have to go back and I'm going to have to memorize all the details of that puzzle piece again. Or I just put a puzzle piece in the middle and I'm like, I'm going to build out from the middle from this one piece and hope that I get there. That is a much more challenging way to build a jigsaw puzzle. And that tends to be the way we study. So build that foundation, the outside first, the big picture, and start recreating and reorganizing and recategorizing. And then everything starts to just sort of fill in. And that's where you want to be the week of the exam. Not, oh crap, I forgot what the first piece that I looked at is, but I've memorized these other 150, but I have no idea how they go together. So you're organizing the material in a way that doesn't tangle it to begin with, but allows you to group it and organize it in the way that makes sense with your knowledge and with what's coming and with what you've already learned. So I also recommend you break your study time apart. So again, start with a targeted review. Here are the things I got wrong last time. Here are the things that I'm really struggling with. Spend your first 20 or 30 minutes on that. Then move to consolidation and practice. Now I'm going to think about how I can make all these connections so that I have a stronger understanding of what I wasn't struggling with, so I can start connecting it, or what I was struggling with, so I can start connecting it with what I wasn't struggling with, and working on some problems, practice exams, whatever, in order to test your knowledge. And then take a preview of what's coming next and continue this giant cycle of learning. The other thing that I hear a lot from students is, well, I start doing practice exams the week of the exam. I don't want to start doing practice exam until I've learned all the material. And the other thing that I hope to really sort of impart in this session is practice exams and practice problems are not something you do after you've quote unquote learned everything. Practice problems and retrieval, those are part of the learning process. So you want to stick that in your learning process right away. And I recommend if your instructor gives you a practice test at the beginning of a unit, that you sit down with that practice test and part of your scoping and your preview and looking through it. And you're not going to know how to answer any of it, but you're going to start seeing some terms, and then you have focus. Like, oh, I remember seeing that in that practice exam. So then you know what to pay attention to and what to start categorizing and what to start prioritizing and how you're going to make those relationships. And you're seeing right away the types of questions that are going to be asked, the way those questions are asked, which again, just gives you more focus on what matters as you move through the material. And so it's going to help you build that foundation again, where you're taking this really broad-based look and saying, okay, now that I have this really basic understanding, I am going to start building the story up from that outside in. Like if you're building a house, you're going to start with the foundation and then build the walls. You're not going to start nailing like drywall to a board and then hope that it fits in at the end. You're going to go from the big part and then fill in the details as you go, where you're finally just putting bathroom tiles in or whatever it happens to be. So same type of idea with your studying. Foundation first, details come later. And don't think of your lectures as our concepts as isolated topics. Don't go in and go, okay, this week we learned that, and this week we're learning this. How does this week's material relate to last week's material? All of it is going to be integrated, and the more you integrate it and connect it, the more it's going to stick in your brain, and the more you're just going to be filling in gaps instead of trying to build out from one individual puzzle piece. So continue to integrate the new knowledge with the old knowledge. A lot of times people talk about mnemonic devices, and those are great, but I recommend analogies. Like create a story or an analogy, because now you have to bring in a lot of different pieces and think about how those pieces go together, instead of just sort of like some Roy G. Biv, which will help you understand the order of the colors in the rainbow. But create an analogy for how the electrons get excited within a system and how they integrate with life, and how like an atom is built sort of like a ladder, and this idea of quantization, and how can you put all this stuff together to build a big analogy picture, not an isolated event that you're then later trying to piece together when you don't know what's really happening. and explain what you've learned to somebody. This, along with starting your sessions with rewriting your notes from memory and using active recall sessions, this is going to be how you find out what you know and don't know, so you can be very purposeful with your study time. So the last thing that I really want to talk about here is an idea which is called interleaving and taking purposeful breaks, which in learning science and neuroscience is called a percolation time. So there is a level of efficiency with your studying versus time. And so what happens is you have this really great efficiency, or you're really focused for a short period of time. And as you continue looking at your books or continue to like push through a study time, your efficiency and your focus decays rapidly to a point where there's really no more learning. So if you talk to somebody and they're like, yeah, I studied 6 hours straight in the library, there was probably 20 minutes of that study time that was actually focused and efficient towards learning. So instead of just sitting down for these like marathon study sessions, break them up. So take purposeful timed breaks and also interleave your subjects. So instead of sitting down for a marathon study session, what research shows is most of us can really be attentive and focused for about 20 minutes. So spend 20 minutes studying, take a break, come back, take another 20 minutes, take a break, come back, take another 20 minutes, take a break, come back. And that way your efficiency and your focus is up there at the peak, instead of just dropping off rapidly where you're just wasting your time staring at books and not learning anything. So an example of taking purposeful breaks and interleaving material is, say you're going to study for 2 classes for that day. Do a 20-minute targeted review session for 1 class and a 5 to 10 minute break where you're setting a timer, so that you don't take a 30-minute break when you intend to take a 10-minute break. And the other thing that I recommend, it doesn't matter what you do, they have done so many studies on, some people play video games and other people take a walk and some people scroll on social media or other people watch TV, and it doesn't really matter what they do in their break time. This is still going to lead to more efficient studying and more focus when you come back. But I have found for myself, if I decide I'm going to scroll through social media, I'm like, okay, I meant to do that for 10 minutes and 45 minutes have passed. Or if I want to watch a TV show, I'm like, I'll just wait till the whole TV show ends. Like, it's hard for me to take that 5 to 10 minute break. But if you go for a walk or something like that, you tend not to take these extended breaks. But whatever you do, again, doesn't really matter as much as making sure that you take that intentional break, but set a timer so that you're really keeping it to a 5 to 10 minute window so that you're not overbreaking yourself. Then you come back, 20 minutes of targeted review, but you're going to do the targeted review for a different class. So say you start off with chemistry, then you're going to do math. You're going to take a 5 to 10 minute break. Then you're going to come back and you're going to go back to class A and do a 20-minute consolidation, 5 to 10 minute break, 20 minutes of consolidation of your class B, and now you're going to take a longer break. Go to the gym, have some lunch, switch up your study time. Maybe you have another class that you have to go to, whatever it happens to be, but this is what's called a percolation time. All the material is starting to settle in, your brain's starting to make sense of it, it's giving it a chance to kind of organize it on its own. And then you're going to come back, 20 minutes of practice problems for class A, break. 20 minutes of practice problems for class B, break. 10 to 20 minute preview of class A. What are you doing in the next lecture period? Again, actively asking you all the questions of connections. Take a little break, 10 to 20 minutes of preview for your second class, and then go live your life. And you have gotten a lot more efficient studying done in a very purposeful and targeted way that will be way more productive towards your ability to be good on assessments and nail those grades that you want, while also being able to find some balance in your life. There are non-academic skills that are needed for success. First and foremost is consistency. If you don't have a schedule or a daily routine, one of my favorite quotes is, success is found in your daily routine. How successful you are is based off of what you do daily. So set a daily routine, schedule things, revise that weekly so that you're able to get everything done, which includes doing the life living events that outside of academia that you want to do. Start prioritizing your tasks. So if you don't have time to get everything done, at least you got the most important things done. Start building these strong foundational habits. If you don't have strong habits in your life, what ends up happening is when you don't want to do things, you default to the path of least resistance, which most often means not doing what you're supposed to do. But if you build a daily routine and create these habits and make sure you're getting some sleep, then your default is to the habits which are good and productive towards whatever your goal in life is. Make sure that you're sleeping. I used to be a you can sleep when you're dead person. Now I'm like, take a disco nap instead of studying if you are tired. There is so much organization that your brain does when you are in deep REM, and you are never going to be able to learn or encode anything into your long-term memory if you're not ever sleeping. I have severe sleep apnea, and I was definitely like, yeah, whatever. The first thing that goes is sleep. And then I discovered I have sleep apnea, and then I got a CPAP, and then I started sleeping and was like, my whole life changed. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I lived my life like that. Life is so much better when you get some sleep and learn ways to do stress management and do some, real take care of your mental health. So hopefully you're able to integrate some of these things into what you're already doing. And as you start integrating things in, it's important to self-reflect. What are the tools that I'm using? How are they working? How are they not using? How can I integrate them in with what I'm already doing? What should I ditch? Like really take some time to analyze and think about all of the things that you're doing. And we will be doing a 3-day learning workshop in January where we're really building on a lot of these topics. So if you're interested in learning more about a workshop and learning more about how you can start building in more study techniques and more higher order thinking skills, this is a great thing that you could do. Again, we're just going to really walk through and work on a lot of things like how to build solid mind maps, how you can really start building on these sort of baseline increase to these higher learning thinking skills that will be very effective towards your ability to be successful in college. So that is my presentation, and I do have a little bit of time left if there's any questions at all. You will be emailed a PDF of this PowerPoint and a recording of this little workshop that was done here. But again, I'll stick around for a little bit if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining. I very much hope this is helpful, and I hope you're able to integrate things in that bring you some success as you move through your college career. Good. Give it a go and sit with the discomfort. Please ask me some questions. I'm super happy to answer.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. First of all, this presentation was really amazing. Thank you so much for the time.
Okay.
It was really helpful. I have a question. So right now I am at Chandler Gilbert Community College, and one of the things that we really work on is like trying to figure out how much time you need to study per class per week to figure out a way to be successful. And I think this was a huge help, so I appreciate it. I have a question. So I'm looking to transfer to the University of Arizona next year, starting in August. I've reached out to the transfer committee lady. Her name was Kimberly, and she has not heard. I've not received an email back or anything from her. Do you know anything more about that kind of stuff or no?
I don't really. I would try reaching out again. And I
Gotcha.
would also hit up the registration office and see if you can get anybody to respond to you from there, and like call if the emails aren't happening. Like sometimes you just have to be pretty proactive. I've actually heard this comment from a lot of people, which is super frustrating, but I would just keep reaching out and again, make a phone call or come down and go to the registration office and speak to somebody in person if you're not able to get a response.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You bet. Good luck.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question about what you were mentioning about like purposeful breaks. And so like the 20-minute like sessions and then 5 to 10 minute breaks, but what about like the longer break? Like about how much time would you say like to spend in that?
Well, I think it kind of depends on how much you have left to do. So a lot of times people are like, I need to make sure that I study for, like, I always recommend that you study for the classes that you have lecture for that day, and that you try to do at least an hour per class. So let's say you have 2 classes on Mondays, then you're going to want to study for roughly an hour for each of those classes, breaking up your time. And so it's kind of up to you, as long as you get that time in and you're not like, sacrificing sleep. Then it sort of depends. Like for myself, I like to spend maybe an hour and a half studying, and then I hit the gym and get some lunch. So maybe that break is 2 to 3 hours, and then I come back and work through my other stuff. And then I still have my evening available so that I can hang out with some friends or take some town time or whatever it happens to be. Other days there's like an event going on, so I end up taking a really long break, and then I spend a little bit more time in the evening because my break was a little bit longer, but I still try to make sure I fit it all in. And that's why I recommend creating a big study schedule, so you kind of block out time and say, all right, here are the things I want to do, here are the things I have to do, how can I fit in my study time, and then just kind of deciding how long the breaks are going to be from there.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. This was so helpful.
Oh, good, I'm glad. All right. Good luck, everybody. And again, thank you so much for coming.
Hold up, Mrs.
Oh,
Ligo.
I can hear you. Yeah.
So hypothetically, I'm looking to get my first tattoo. All right. And I was thinking about the periodic table because I could always use that on any test.
Absolutely. Put
Recommend
it on
it.
your thigh for easy access. Then you can refer to it very easily. I'm just kidding.
You thinking that or Lewis structure?
Yeah, make sure it's a Lewis structure of a molecule you care about, and make sure
Oh,
they get it right.
what's a good molecule to care about? Let's see. All right.
Like
About
serotonin is the feel good molecule, something like that. I would use something along those lines.
all right.
Testosterone might be a good one that gives you a lot of power and strength. So I would put something like that. Caffeine, that would probably be what I would do, but that's just because I'm a caffeine junkie. So those are just some ideas.
I have also question. What would THC look like as a Lewis structure?
THC is a very large molecule.
Is it?
Yes. Lots
All
of
right.
rings, lots of conjugation. It's really cool looking though. So it would be a fun one.
That would be. All right, that's all.
All right, anything else for me? Yeah, your back is a really big canvas, so that's a good one. All right, thank you so much. Take care.